So welcome back. The last part of the lecture is on affective neuroscience, and I'll give you a brief introduction to this field that you could consider separately from cognitive neuroscience. However, that's going to be one of my arguments, the lines between cognitive and affective neuroscience are becoming more and more blurry. So we're talking about these quadrants 2 and 4 of the model that are initially introduced here. First of all, a question that I typically ask my classroom in person is to define what is an emotion. I'll give you a couple of seconds here to consider this, but you can also pause the video and think about it. Think about what your answer to this question might be. What is an emotion? And this is a wonderful quote from Fair and Russell in 1984. Everyone knows what an emotion is until asked to give a definition. Then it seems no one knows. So there are some inherent problems there. So you might sort of intuitively know what an emotion is, but how do you define it? And when it comes to research, how would you operationalize it? And so typically the answers that you hear are things like, well, it's a feeling, it's when I'm happy or sad, it's when my physical sensations change in a sense, it's when I'm aroused, it's when I get excited. So there are many types of answers that you can get, and they're all correct. But there are multiple aspects to feeling, and I favor a definition or an operationalization, sorry about stuttering there, of emotions that is related to the function of the emotion. So what does an emotion actually do? What's its purpose? And in my view, the purposes of emotions are to motivate behavior, to make sure that we do the things, we approach the things that are good for us, and we avoid the things that are bad for us. And these are strong motivations that emotions can bring about. So let's start with a brief history of affective neuroscience. It actually started way back when. You can even go back further if you want to the Greek philosophers, but actual research on emotion started with Charles Darwin's lesser known book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal, published in 1872. And what he was doing is he was comparing these sketches that he was drawing of animal emotions in a dog, in a swan, and human emotion, like here in a woman. And he was struck by how actually similar the expressions are of emotions across species. So indicating that it seems to be that there are basic emotions that are evolutionarily preserved across these species. A set of basic emotions that are present in all species, basically. And this has then yielded follow-up research, and probably the most famous of this follow-up research is research by Ekman and colleagues who investigated 6 basic emotions across cultures. And those are facial expressions of these emotions that Ekman and colleagues took across cultures. And I know you've heard this story before. That include sadness, disgust, anger, surprise, etc. So what they did is they took these figures, these pictures, and asked participants from different cultures around the globe. In an initial study, 10 cultures, but this has been expanded to ever more distant cultures from our society, to rate these emotions that are expressed on scales that they gave them. So how much do you think this emotion is expressing sadness? And they find stark agreement in interpretations of these facial expressions across cultures. And this has been now replicated multiple times. So indicating basically that not just across species, but also across cultures, these basic emotions seem to be preserved. So it's not influenced by culture, and it seems to be an evolutionarily stable trait that we have, that we can express and recognize these types of emotions. So this has this basic emotion theory was then researched in early neuroscience studies that have looked at this in affective neuroscience. And they did the same thing. They presented faces to people in the scanner, subjects in the scanner, and then asked them actually not to do anything, but to just watch them in early studies, and looked, instead of the rating responses, they looked at the neural responses to these emotions. And they find that some faces, some facial expressions lead to amygdala activation, and so do IAPS pictures that also trigger emotions. So IAPS pictures are from the International Affective Picture System, and they display relatively striking scenes that trigger emotion. So you can see these activations here around the amygdala to mostly angry faces and fearful faces, which we're not showing here. This then has led to the proposal in a meta-analysis by Stefan Hamann that who looked at all the neuroimaging studies at this time point, so in 2012, that there are specific activation patterns within the brain that seem to distinguish the different emotions, namely happiness, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. So here he's showing differential activation for fear versus sadness, where fear is in blue. You can see the amygdala activation here, and sadness is in red. It seems to be more in the medial and lateral parts of the frontal cortex. And he's arguing this. One highly influential type of discrete emotion theory, namely basic emotion theory, proposes a limited set of basic emotions, for example, happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise, that are universal, biologically inherited, and have unique physiological and neural profiles that distinguish them from one another. This is one theory, but there's another theory on the other hand that proposes that this may not be the case. And this is a more recent meta-analysis by Lindquist et al., also published in 2012, but a little bit later. And it argues basically that while there is consistency of some regions activating two emotional stimuli, like the amygdala here, which activates anger, disgust, fear, happiness, and sadness, and you can see the number of studies that have reported activation in this region in the bars here, up to 50, especially for the experience of disgust and the perception of fear. There seems to be a lack of specificity. So if what Hamann was saying is true, or if what basic emotion theory is proposing was true, then you should only see the bar for fear and none of the other bars. So there should be specificity. But we do not have this specificity. And in fact, this is true for all regions that have been implicated in emotion, which you can see in this graph here, and you can see this more detailed in the actual paper. So basically indicating that while there is consistency across studies, so these regions do respond more to emotional stimuli than other stimuli, there's a lack of specificity. And this suggests that basic emotion theory is not correct. There's not one region or one neural profile that distinguishes one emotion from another emotion, unless we haven't discovered it yet. It seems to be more that there's a more interactive component that makes the story a little bit more complicated. And this is where psychological constructivism comes in. Because of a lack of specificity, the authors of this meta-analysis are proposing an alternative view of how the brain processes emotions. This view conceptualizes emotions as arising from the combination of fundamental or more basic processes. Let's say arousal and valence, right? So we have arousal, which may be processed in the amygdala, and then other regions in the brain that add the valence component to it, and then maybe other regions in the brain that add additional components to this. So from these basic processes that all act in unison and are all processed potentially in different areas of the brain, we then interpret an emotional state at the cognitive level as indicating happiness or sadness or anger or other types of emotions. So it's a categorization question that we're asking here. And this complexity also plays out at the level of the brain. So what I'm showing here are regions that, well, this is actually a meta-analysis that I got from Neuroscience, which is a nice a tool that I'll mention it in the posts later on. Neuroscience allows you to do meta-analyses specific to some terms. And the terms I used here are emotion and cognition. And then I'm plotting the overlap between these two meta-analyses. Overlap means basically those are voxels in the brain that activate to both emotion and cognition. And this is following up on the constructivism story, whereas the basic emotion theory would predict that there is a single region within the brain for each basic emotion. It looks more like what constructivism is predicting, namely that it's a much more complex process that arises from relatively basic components, which then become interpreted as specific emotions. So that's what I'm showing here. So we see emotional regions like the insula, the striatum, and the amygdala here, and the anterior cingulate cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex here. This is the posterior cingulate cortex. And what you see is that many of these regions actually light up in purple, which means they are both important for emotional processes and for cognitive processes. And this indicates at a very basic level, again, that this picture of separating emotions and cognitions is not as easy. So maybe affective and cognitive processes are not as separate as we initially thought, but also that the question of, well, what is the neural representation of emotions may be more complex. In fact, it may require cognitive processes for us to be able to interpret, to categorize what the current arousal level, valence level actually means before we can identify this as an emotion and what type of emotion it is. So it looks like cognitive and emotional processes are intertwined. In the other directions, why would cognitive processes need emotional processes? Well, I mentioned this earlier, the brain really requires us to be motivated, and emotions provide some form of motivation for us to do cognitive processes, to engage in effortful thinking, in a sense. This is what this is suggesting, and there's a lot of evidence for this. So on the one hand, emotions influence cognitions, and this is very easily illustrated in the case of memory. But on the other hand, cognitions also influence emotions. But let's have a look at this direction first. So this is a study also from Stefan Hamann and published in Nature in 1999, and he used these IAPS pictures. And you can see that these are not the most distressing ones. And they were paired with these types of words. And subjects were scanned while they looked at these IAPS pictures during encoding. That's what these images show. And brain images show that later on, let's say a week or two after the scans were taken, subjects then were asked to recall these. And the brain images show a correlation between activity during encoding, so this is an emotional encoding because it's paired with these IAPS pictures, and recall performance at a later time, particularly in the region of the amygdala here. Note that this is a bit of an older study, but it makes a point that emotions can enhance memory, and that this correlation shows up even later. And there's a correlation between performance at the time of scan and recall of emotional material 2 weeks later, or about 2 weeks after the scan was taken. Now, looking at the opposite direction, cognitions can also influence our emotions. And one good example in this direction is cognitive reappraisal. And this has been studied, so this is something that is a form of regulating your emotions using cognitive processes. It's best described as framing a situation that is negative as actually something that is neutral or positive, and vice versa if that is of advantage. So let's read an instruction that is commonly provided in these types of studies. This is a cognitive reappraisal instruction given to participants. Please watch the following film clip carefully. This time as you watch, try to think about the situation you see in a more positive light. You can achieve this in several different ways. For example, try to imagine advice that you could give to the characters in the film clip to make them feel better, right? So think about this in another way. This could be advice that would help them to think about the positive bearing this event could have on their lives, or think about the good things they might learn from this experience. Keep in mind that even though a situation may be painful in the moment, in the long run, it could make one's life better or have unexpected good outcomes. So you never know, right? It's a way to take a negative event and put a positive spin on it. And it's something that we commonly use to make us feel better when something bad happens to us. And that's exactly what was studied in this early work here by Oxner et al., where they used this kinds of cognitive reappraisal instruction to study reactions to these types of IAPS pictures again, so negative images. And then they did this under conditions of positive and negative arousal. So participants were asked to view this image and then to reappraise the emotions that they felt, and then to rate how successful they were in reappraising. Then there were also neutral scenes as a control condition and an attend condition, where they simply attended the image and the emotions they felt towards the image without reappraising. Let me skip this. What they're finding is they're revealing neural circuits of emotion regulation. And when participants were regulating, so when they were reappraising relative to attending, activation by reappraisal, that's shown in green. So we see the lateral prefrontal cortex here and here as well. And this is the ratings they gave in the study. So when they were attending to the emotions, they gave a relatively high strength of negative affect. However, when they reappraised, they gave almost half the strength of the negative affect that they were experiencing, which was much closer to watching or looking at a neutral image like this scene here. So that means behaviorally, attending works. Neurally, reappraising works. Neurally, reappraising leads to a greater activation of lateral prefrontal regions, and at the same time suppresses activity in the medial orbitofrontal cortex as well as in the amygdala. And this is what's been replicated multiple times now. This is a meta-analysis by some of the same authors. And you can see that during reappraisal across 48 different studies, you see the activation of this lateral prefrontal region, which is also one of the cognitive control regions, right? And as a side note, these regions also match the types of regions that we observe when we look at the overlap between emotional and cognitive processes. We have the singular cortex here, for instance, and the lateral prefrontal regions, which basically are going up on the outside of the brain here, but we can't really see them. So what is all of this doing? So it looks like that these are inhibitory regions that are suppressing the activity of the amygdala here. So we have regions that become active during cognitive reappraisal, namely prefrontal regions, right? Lateral prefrontal regions, and regions that become less active during reappraisal, which are emotional regions that might signal the negative valence or arousal related to these emotions that these pictures trigger. So let me wrap up here by saying that emotions are important also for decision making. So if emotions can influence cognitive processes, right? If there's this bilateral interaction between cognition and emotion, then the types of cognitive processes that we're interested in here in this model, namely representation, which may be related to perception, the valuation, then action selection, which are mostly motor cognitive processes, outcome evaluation, which is a comparison and value between what you expected and observed, and then learning, then these should also be able to be influenced by emotional processes. Emotion may influence all of these different processes in the decision-making cascade. So the cognitive processes that we need to make decisions, that we need to form a decision, according to this theory, can be influenced by emotions as well. So let me conclude here. So what we covered this week is we've answered the question, what is neuroeconomics? How did neuroeconomics evolve? So what are the historical backgrounds for neuroeconomics? And we'll cover some of this in the crash course on the brain in the first tutorial. What are the goals of neuroeconomics? What does it want to accomplish? Namely, to establish the biological basis of decision-making. And we've also talked about important distinctions in brain processes. We've talked about cognitive versus affective distinctions, automatic versus conscious or effortful. And we've talked about cognition-emotion interactions. We will now move on, now that you have a general introduction to neuroscience and to neuroeconomics. We will move on to talk about valuation next, individual decision-making, including risk and intertemporal choice and how this is represented in the brain. And then we'll move on to social decision-making. So the goals of this course in general are first and foremost to excite you in neuroeconomics and the potential applications of interdisciplinary research, right? So we have different fields that can actually add to each other and do more together than they can do individually. And neuroeconomics is one example of this type of interdisciplinary work. But also, I want you to understand the potential strengths and weaknesses of studies, of experiments, and to be able to understand and critically assess different types of experiments, also from different areas of research. Again, I want to train you to think in an interdisciplinary fashion and to be able to critically evaluate methods from different research fields. So I thank you for your attention. I know this has been quite a bit of material, and please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Here's my email address. And I shall see you guys on Wednesday when we meet in person. Okay, thank you.